And I'm going to read from some of the President's comments about that to give you a better idea of Larry. He's one of the preeminent scholars on the Haudenosaunee history and on New York's interaction with them after the Revolutionary War. This is a picture of his book. It's called Conspiracy of Interest, Iroquois Dispossession and the Rise of New York State. And I highly recommend it. It talks about primarily about the Onondagas, because the Onondagas were the first nation to face the onslaught of New York after the Revolutionary War, and how the need for their land resulted in it being taken, even though they, and some of them, fought on the side of the Americans. An excuse used against the Cayugas and the Onondaga. And it talks about the interaction, the conspiracies between the people who were on one hand the land negotiators for the state and their brothers and cousins, who were the land speculators, setting themselves up to be wealthy and to steal the Oneida land. And the same pattern is true for Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, the same set of facts. This book has won awards. He's written probably a dozen books, won a lot of awards, many other articles. He's testified for the Cayugas and many other nations. And in 1999, when he was granted Distinguished Professor, the president of New Paltz said this about him. He is most deserving of the title. Larry Hauptman is one of New Paltz's most distinguished and prolific scholars, whose work about, with, and for Native Americans of New York State stands as a model of engaged historical scholarship. We are fortunate to count Professor Hauptman as one of our own. And we are fortunate to have Larry here with us tonight. So please welcome Professor Lawrence Hauptman.
Big enough to say that? Okay. I'd like to first thank the Onondaga Nation, especially the Council of Chiefs, for allowing me to come here to speak. And second, I'd like to thank Joe Heath for those kind words, Andy Major, and Syracuse University. I've been affiliated indirectly and directly with Syracuse University for years. I have this warm feeling because my daughter attended Syracuse University, and I've had a wonderful relationship over the years with the University Press, which is one of the jewels of this university, and I always like to say nice things about the university. At the present time, most New Yorkers cannot conceive that the entire central portion of the state was once the domain of three separate but culturally and historically united nations, and that American investors deceived and took advantage of the natives, much like Europeans did in the race for gold, diamonds, and rubber in Africa in the 19th century. However, that is precisely how the Onondagas, as well as the Oneidas and Cayugas in the past and in the present, view this dark page in their history. It is also very difficult to view salt as a commodity the way oil is seen today. From ancient times onward, nations became entangled in conflicts over which country would control the salt mines or brine laden with salt. In a recent exquisitely written book by Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Alan Taylor, which focuses on Iroquois history from the 1760s to the early 19th century, this eminent author made one passing reference to Onondaga Lake and no reference to salt as a factor in the dispossession of the Iroquois. Yet in three so-called New York State Onondaga treaties in 1788, 1793, and 1795, the focal point of these negotiations was salt and its marketing along a planned new transportation corridor that would lead to the expansion of white settlement, rising land values, and greater profit for speculators. For 7 years between 1788 and 1795, treaty negotiations between New York State officials and the Onondagas centered on the acquisition of the Salt Lake and Salt Springs surrounding it, as it was referred. In each of these so-called state Onondaga treaties, access to salt was a key factor. New York State finally secured possession of this resource on July 28, 1795, in a treaty with the Onondagas. This accord was in clear violation of the Federal Trade and Intercourse Acts of 1790 and 1793 that required that a federal commissioner be present to supervise treaty negotiations and ensure good faith with the Indians. This so-called treaty was never ratified by the United States Senate nor proclaimed by the President as required of all binding treaties after July 1790. Under its provisions, New York State acquired this resource processed from the brine of the region when the state commissioners, led by Philip Schuyler, agreed to pay the Onondaga Nation $500 and a $200 annuity, along with a yearly payment of 100 bushels of salt every June. Long before the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, salt had contributed to the establishment of this region. Indeed, as early as 1797, the Onondaga area, quote, supplied almost all the salt used in the United States, according to one source, end quote. The boiling of the salt-rich brine went on 24 hours a day in large 100 to 150-gallon kettles and spurred spin-off industries such as barrel making in central New York. Previously, in the 1780s, New York State was extremely weak. It's hard to imagine this, but New York was pretty much a fourth-rate state. Much of the fighting of the American Revolution had ravaged the Hudson and Mohawk valleys, since the state was one of the major battlegrounds of the war. The state's economy was largely in shambles. New York, the fourth most populated state and the one most affected by the continued British presence. 5 British military forces were on New York soil until August of 1796. And consequently, New York was in a very, very weakened state. British military forces were also poised across the northern and western boundaries of the state, namely the St. Lawrence River, Lake Ontario, Niagara River, Lake Erie frontier. Hence, a bankrupt state whose security was threatened by the evil empire, Great Britain, needed a plan to develop quickly. Right after the American Revolution, Christopher Coles, an Irish-born civil engineer connected to Simeon DeWitt, New York Surveyor General, proposed the linking of the Hudson River with the Great Lakes by means of a natural and artificial waterway. Coles' idea was published in pamphlet form in 1785 as proposals for the speedy settlement of the waste and unappropriated lands on the western frontiers of the state of New York and the improvement of inland navigation between Albany and Oswego. Hence, by the very definition, Coles interpreted Iroquois as, quote, a waste and unappropriated land in need of state development, arguing on political, economic, and national security grounds. In 1785, the proposal led to the introduction of a New York State legislative bill, quote, for improving the navigation of the Mohawk River, Wood Creek, and Onondaga River with a view to opening an inland navigation to Oswego and for extending the same, if practical, to Lake Erie, end quote. The New York State Legislature, proposing to speed up settlement, passed 2 laws in 1784 and 1785 to facilitate the settlement of the waste and unappropriated lands, as they called it, in the state, and set up procedures to advertise and distribute Indian lands even before the state had bought title. Previously, state officials had pointed out to the Indians that they were going to be treated fairly and the Indians' land base would be respected. Governor Clinton gave assurances indicating that in order to prevent Indian-white disputes and conflict, the provision in the New York State Constitution forbidding Indian land sales to individuals without legislative permission would be enforced. Because of its strategic location, entrepreneurs and state officials saw the Oneida, Onondaga, and Cayuga homeland as essential to the rise of New York State. The Empire State's cities of Utica, Rome, Syracuse, and Auburn were within this, would eventually become part of this area. The development of major canals. The first canal experiment, the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company, in the 1790s, as well as later canals, the Black River, Hugh and Seneca Lake, Chenango, Erie, and Oneida Lake canals, and the construction of the first state road, the Genesee Turnpike, sometimes called the Seneca Turnpike, Route 5, were all part of this plan. Moreover, to the west of Oneida Territory were the extensive salt deposits in the environs of today's Syracuse, and the vast lands of the new military tract, the former estate of the Onondaga and Cayuga Indians. To make these lands west of Oneida attractive for sale, roads and canals had to be constructed, and for that to happen, lands and or rights of way had to be secured from the Haudenosaunee. As I discussed in my previous writings, the major New York State families, although major political and economic rivals, conspired to get at the Iroquois land base. Whether it was the Livingstons, Clintons, or Schuylers, each of these powerful families and their allies saw New York's future and their own resulting economic success as requiring the reduction of the Indian land base. Despite repeated promises of American as well as New York State protection, these powerful families at times tripped over their own feet, competing with each other in their lust for Indian lands. They saw that if New York State was open to the improvement of navigable waterways, the building of canals, and the construction of turnpikes, there would be a result, a sizable increase of white population. Economic growth would spur land sales as well as land prices, benefiting these powerful families and their political cronies. Thus, to these families, the Oneidas, Onondagas, and Cayugas stood in the path of progress, preventing the development of the transportation network needed for the future growth of the Empire State. The New York State Surveyor General's Office, headed by Simeon DeWitt from 1784 onward, and the land companies such as the Holland Land Company had an incestuous relationship working against Haudenosaunee interests. For example, Moses DeWitt, hope you know DeWitt, Simeon's cousin, was a leading speculator in central New York and the new military tract lands after Simeon's survey laid it out. Simeon was a cousin of DeWitt Clinton, frequently credited as the father of the Erie Canal, and a nephew of Governor George Clinton, the governor of New York at the time of the New York State Onondaga treaties of 1788 and 1793. Albany officials soon turned to purchasing Oneida lands as well as those of the Onondagas and Cayugas. Yet the rivalry of New York's most powerful families delayed any state sale. Governor Clinton's efforts had to take a backseat for 3 years. I'm not going to go into all the details of that, of the rivalry of the families involved in stepping over their own toes. But on March 1st, 1788, the New York State Legislature passed an act appointing commissioners to hold treaty with the Indians within the state. The 1788 extinguishment of Indian land titles of the Onondagas and Oneidas should be seen as one package deal and illustrate quite clearly state officials' motivation to secure lands and resources from these two Iroquois nations. On September 12, 10 years before the state treaty with the Oneidas, the New York commissioners negotiated an agreement with the Onondagas. Among state commissioners were Richard Varick, the brother-in-law of Simeon DeWitt, and Judge Egbert Benson, later Attorney General of New York, and at the time, agent of the Holland Land Company, as well as Hudson Valley Federalist ally of Philip Schuyler. Provision 4 of the Onondaga Treaty of 1788 reads, quote, "The salt lake and the lands for 1 mile around the same shall forever remain the common benefit of the people of the state of New York and the Onondagas and their posterity for the purpose of making salt, and shall not be granted in or anywise disposed of for other purposes." Joint occupation. On March 11, 1793, another New York State Onondaga treaty reiterated the joint ownership of the so-called Salt Lake. Yet in another so-called treaty in 1795, New York State unilaterally obtained lands from the Onondaga that they needed to found the vastly important New York State Salt Reservation in 1797. According to the standard history of New York used by 2 generations of college students, quote, New York produced over 7 million bushels of salt, or 59% of the national output, as late as 1859. The salt springs near Syracuse, once a source of power for the Onondagas, came under the jurisdiction of the state in 1795. End quote. Hence, in order to get at the salt, establish a great enterprise, a non-Indian settlement in central New York to take advantage of this potential wealth and market this resource, a transportation route had to be built. Oneida lands and surrounding Adirondack forest also provided the timber, the fuel necessary for salt processing, as well as the materials for Liverpool's line of coopers making barrels for the transport of the salt. Elkin and Watson, Cole's contemporary and major land speculator in the new military tract, was the great propagandist for canals in the early republic. In September 1788, this businessman attended the two treaties, Onondaga and Oneida, at Fort Schuyler, formerly known as Fort Stanwix, and wrote down his thoughts. In his extensive memoirs, Watson recorded his journey through Mohawk country to Fort Stanwix. After describing the Indians en route, Watson then envisioned the future of the area, predicting accurately the rise of central New York. Leaving Fort Stanwix, Watson concluded, quote, that a canal communication will be open sooner or later from the Great Lakes to the Hudson, end quote. 3 years later, at the insistence of Watson, 3 prominent New Yorkers, Jeremiah Van Rensselaer, Stephen Bayard, and Philip Van Cortlandt, all major investors in the new military tract toward New York with the aim of canal development, which passed through Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca Indian lands. Throughout Watson's memoirs, he frequently alluded to the potential of a future canal between Onondaga country and Oswego, and to the emergence of a great city, predicting the future rise of Syracuse, emerging within the environs of central New York because of its geographic position and its access to salt. Later, Watson's book, History of the Rise and Progress of Existing Condition of Western Canals in the State of New York, published in 1820, became the Bible for promoting canals in the state. Indeed, it reads as a great commercial prospectus for central and western New York, much like a modern state, federal, or foreign investment brochure. Coles, the engineer, and Watson, the promoter, were part of larger forces at work in the early republic, namely national political leaders such as John Calhoun, DeWitt Clinton, Albert Gallatin, Gouverneur Morris, and Philip Schuyler, each of whom was responsible for adding elements to the formula for making New York the Empire State. Connected to Watson was Philip Schuyler, the Federalist. Schuyler was without doubt the major player in securing these lands. The omnipotent Schuyler, using his past connections to the Oneida Indians and drawing on his powerful family and political alliances. His son-in-law, by the way, was Alexander Hamilton. His other son-in-law was Stephen Van Rensselaer, the richest man in the state of New York and the biggest promoter of salt, along with Peter Porter. In 1792, Schuyler, former general and United States Senator from New York, was the founder and president of the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company, the precursor to the Erie Canal, which was designed to open a navigable channel from Albany to Seneca Lake and Lake Ontario to market potash, wheat, lumber, and especially salt. Schuyler and Watson's goal, which they successfully accomplished, was to open a link channel which combined natural waterways, improved natural waterways, and short canals. This Western Inland Lock Navigation Company is forgotten in history, but really is the precursor of the whole canal era. Schuyler's actions were not only clearly aided and abetted by divisions within the Iroquois world, but by the actions of missionary Samuel Kirkland and his longtime assistant among the Oneidas, James Dean. One of the wealthiest men and largest landholders in New York, Schuyler, of course, was politically connected both to Washington's administration and also to Albany. Schuyler was the head of the New York State Appropriations Committee, and of course his connection to Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury at that time, also brought in the right connections. The Iroquois were unaware of the powerful forces that were behind their undoing. The Watson-Schuyler Western Inland Lock Navigation Company include the most prominent New Yorkers, as we've been saying. They included, for example, Robert Morris, the prominent Genesee speculator who defrauded the senators at the Treaty of Big Tree in 1797. Theophile Casanova, the major representative of the Holland Land Company, which also purchased shares in the Watson-Schuyler venture. Robert Troup, a leading attorney tied to the Phelps-Gorham land purchase, one of the Pulteney associates and later attorney for both the Holland Land Company and the Ogden Land Company. Stephen Baird, leading merchant capitalist and the largest purchaser of surveyor lots in the new military tract. George Scriba, who along with Peter Smith was the largest investor in lands acquired from the Oneidas, and prominent New York City businessmen such as Nicholas Lowe, Daniel Ludlow, Langton Smith, and Thomas Eddy. Also representing the enterprise were Federalist Rufus King, the soon-to-be U.S. Senator from New York, Goldsboro Bannier, Governor John Jay's son-in-law, and Jonas Platt, one of the most important promoters of central New York lands and one of the major advocates of the later Erie Canal. Nathan Miller, a leading economic historian of the Empire State, has written about this venture capitalist experiment, indicating that these investors saw their future profits largely in an increase in land values. Miller insisted, quote, had Schuyler carefully examined the motives of many of the directors and stockholders, and possibly his own as well, you would have discovered that a large number of them considered the matter of dividends as purely incidental to the company's plans for the improvement of transportation. Miller added that these men were speculators to whom the broad, unsettled stretches